All right, I'm going to say we've hit a good critical mass here. So welcome everybody to this J Street webinar, which I think is important and timely as we strive for our webinars to be. We are convening together with two fantastic guests who I will introduce in just a moment to talk about some developments on the ground in the West Bank, of which I'm sure we are all aware that are extremely concerning, specifically things that really heated up last week when, as folks will know, just to recap a little bit, there was a significant IDF operation in Jenin in which multiple Palestinians, including militants, but not only, were killed. Following that, there was a Palestinian terror attack in the settlement of Eli, and 4 Israeli settlers were killed. And then following that, there were a series of revenge attacks, settler rampages that occurred in multiple locations, multiple Palestinian villages in the West Bank. This, of course, follows on the major pogrom, as it's been called, not only by us, but also senior Israeli security officials, that happened in the Palestinian village of Hawara in February. And so this seems to be a phenomenon that is really metastasizing. It's not new, of course, but we want to take an opportunity to really dig in and talk about the escalation in settler violence, settler attacks, try to understand it, what's being done about it, and what could and should be done about it. So with that said, I'm now going to introduce the great panelists who are joining us today, and we're so grateful for that. We have Lior Amihai, who serves as the Executive Director of Peace Now, or Shalom Achshav. Peace Now is Israel's first anti-occupation organization. It's a leading voice in monitoring and challenging the settlement movement. Now, before recently adopting this post at Peace Now, Lior had served as Executive Director of Yesh Din, which uses legal means to enhance access to justice for Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. And I would note that Yesh Din monitors settler violence in particular very carefully. So this is something that Lior has had a very close eye on for some time now. We're also really pleased to have with us Celine Touboul. Celine is the co-CEO of the Economic Cooperation Foundation, or ECF, which is an Israeli think tank that aims to build Israeli-Palestinian partnership in the political, economic, and civil society spheres. Celine leads ECF's policy efforts related to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and we are so happy to have both of you here with us today, Lior and Celine. So with that, we're going to get started. We're going to dive in to the issue of settler violence. And I do want to turn to you, Lior, first, and here's how I'd like to start the discussion. I'd like to get a sense of the trends that we're seeing in terms of the scale of these attacks. We're seeing Israeli security officials using language like nationalist terror and pogroms to describe recent events. Can you give us a sense of what's changing in terms of frequency and intensity of these settler attacks?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Debra. It's nice to see you. And it's nice to be on this great panel with you and with Celine, of course. So thank you for this opportunity. Look, I think from our perspective, there's a couple of things to note. One, that yes, we are sensing, at least from my perspective, some sort of escalation. So definitely there's something that is new, perhaps, or changing in a way. I think maybe we'll discuss how it's coming about, or how does it play this change. What is important for me to stress out before that the terms will be clear is that settler violence has been a phenomena since the first day of the occupation. So this is not new in this sense at all. And not only is it new, is that the purpose of settler violence was the same since since its inception, since the very beginning. It's to scare off and frighten Palestinians and eventually take over their lands and territory and control over the territory. That's the idea behind it. So it's a political tool to achieve political ends. Now, the other thing that's also not new is the role of the military and the government, because the military and the government, since the first day of settler violence, or since the first day of the occupation, is basically giving backing and support to the settler violence. Not directly, of course, in a way that you can say, but very much directly in many other ways. There's no arrests, no indictments. It rewards the perpetrators eventually. Now, what we're seeing now, I think we can it is a sense that we're heating to some point that we haven't seen before, because what we've seen in the past week or two, these pogroms, the military defended these programs, not us. We of course discovered that, is that we see hundreds of settlers, of violent settlers, who feel confident enough to enter Palestinian towns, cities, villages. They feel enough confidence that nothing will happen to them, that they won't be harmed, and they can throw stones, burn cars on the people living there. So I think this also tells you the environment that they're standing at. Now, the idea of dozens or even hundreds of settlers coming together, yes, it is a new phenomena, but we have seen it in the past. So Hawara wasn't the first time either. It did happen before that in South Hebron, in other places in the West Bank before, in dozens or so. I don't know if hundreds, but dozens for sure, of settlers coming together. This has also happened in the past on several occasions. So it's not something unique or so. And I think it's the idea that there's complete no law enforcement. The message that the government is sending these violent settlers is that you can go ahead and do it. Why not? You're achieving your political end. You're scaring off the Palestinians. You're taking over their lands. We're not doing anything to stop you. So why not? On the contrary, we are defending you, we're protecting you, and we're enabling you to take up territory. And of course, you can't completely disregard it, from this government, where you have ministers that are from the fringe of the Israeli society, that have grown up within this the violent settler society, either represented in courts or violent settlers themselves, supported violence in the past, stated as ministers their support for violating the law and for using violence just recently. And I think with this sort of tension, with this sort of environment, the violent settlers feel that they can do whatever they want. And I'll say one more thing, is that the settler leadership and the violent settlers who actually do the violence, they feel that, this is a point that they have to take, this is their point in time. They can do what, if they won't, if they won't achieve their political ends now, then when will they achieve it? And this is why they want to even pressure this government, that they have ministers representing them in the government to achieve their ends. And that is, again, to take over Palestinian land in the occupied territories. And I'll finish here.
Thank you so much for that, Lior. Really, really appreciate it. I just recognized that I didn't take care of a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning, so I'll take an opportunity to do that. First of all, I didn't introduce myself. Debra Shushan, I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Policy at J Street. The other thing that I want to mention, which is important, is that in all of our webinars, if you've tuned in before, you know that we always have opportunity for questions from the audience. So at any point during the webinar, you can feel free to go to the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen and put in any questions that you may have for the panelists. The other thing I want to note on that very briefly is that we, in addition to J Street audience, we have invited staffers from Capitol Hill, and we always give them the opportunity, if they would like to, although anyone can do this, to ask a question anonymously so that they don't have to worry about so we make sure that they ask whatever they want to ask. So please feel free. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can always do that as well. Okay, now with that said, Lior, I want to dive in a little bit deeper in terms of the trends we're seeing. The comments that you made were very helpful. I'm wondering if you're noticing some other trends and differences in terms of the settler attacks. I'm thinking about things like, for example, Yesh Din has documented that there are certain settlements that are known to be especially violent. I'm thinking of like Yitzhar, for example. And so Palestinian villages near those settlements tend to suffer disproportionately. I'm wondering, are we seeing the geographical scope of these attacks expand beyond, particular violent settlements? Are we seeing a shift in tactics? I mean, it seems like arson is being used on a very wide scale. Is that new? Can you dig into those granular details a little bit?
I think, yes, again, new and not new. Not new in the sense that all of the tools that we're seeing and all of the locations that we're seeing the settler violence, none of that is new. Yes, indeed. I don't recall such a pogroms in that extent in as many locations simultaneously at the same time. Various Palestinian communities that they're suffering from this. This I don't recall. But again, all of these Palestinian communities that were under attack this time were under attack in the past. So not new, again, in the locations, not new in the usage of violence, but yes, in the severity, in the quantity of the Israeli participants within them. And again, and I think, and also I think maybe the sense of desperation is, and I think this is maybe what's leading the military to speak out against this, in this bluntly, in the fact that the government is, or parts of the government, not all of the government, are not condemning it at all. On the contrary, sending signals and messages that they're supportive of this. And the military, which played no active role in stopping it in the past, I think maybe, only maybe to an extent, is realizing that this has got under control. The military stated that they cannot stop it. And this is an important point, because the Israeli military has the responsibility by international law to protect Palestinians. They're the people who are under occupation. The mandate of Israel to control the occupied territories is through international law, and that's why it's not annexed to Israel. And that's why if Israel annexes the occupied territories, it's very problematic. And it hasn't done so, and therefore the military is in charge. And therefore the military has the responsibility and authority to defend and to protect the Palestinians. Palestinians have no line of defense. They can't call Palestinian police. They don't have secret services. They don't have a military. That's it. They're left on their own. And for many years at Yesh Din and Peace Now and other human rights groups that are monitoring this, and of course Palestinian groups that are monitoring this, you feel the sense of there's hopelessness. You can't do anything. And now it just feels that it's completely out of control under the extent, the amount, the violence. Like even the military is admitting to. In the past, the military, said it's under control. They didn't do anything, but at least they never said it's not under control. Now they're saying we can't control it.
Yeah, that is quite a dramatic development. Absolutely. We'll come back to this question of accountability, of what the military can or will or won't do, because I think all of that is very important, and I do want to come back to it. I want to be sure to kind of zoom out a little bit as well to the broader situation in the West Bank. And here I'd really like to bring you in, Celine, to give your thoughts about where we are in terms of the deteriorating situation within the West Bank. This has been already 2023, less than 6 months in, an extremely deadly year for Israelis and of course, particularly for Palestinians. And I'd like to get your assessment of the broader security situation particularly within cities in Palestinian cities in the north of the West Bank, like Jenin and Nablus, and throughout the West Bank. What's your assessment of the situation?
Thank you, Debra, and thank you to J Street for the opportunity to speak in that panel. The question you're asking is, in my view, I mean, is related to the events that we just described in Tormuz Aya and in Hawa, but not entirely, because we cannot totally ignore the fact that what we have been seeing in Jenin and Nablus is also about an internal Palestinian dynamic, kind of the result of a declining PA legitimacy and credibility that affect the ability of the Palestinian security forces to be in control of the situation in cities that we need to maybe explain that are part of Area A, which is under the security responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, but because of lack of a political horizon, we cannot ignore that it affects the PA legitimacy, but also repeated incursion by the IDF that has also affected its credibility as the one that is supposed to be in charge of maintaining law and order in this city. So all this situation has contributed to a situation in which there are groups in the city that not only challenge the Israeli forces, but also the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian forces. Now, where is the connection with the issue that we discussed before and of this violence by a radical nationalist group of settlers? It is connected in the sense that what Lior described, the hopelessness, the inability of the Palestinians to do anything when they are attacked, the fact that the PA is not in charge in this area and cannot really come and protect them, contribute also to this declining legitimacy and feed in a way the empower this group that act in these cities to challenge both the Palestinian security forces and to kind of gain in popularity because of the anger and that this violence is generating.
So Celine, and I want to say, folks, I just told you how you could put your questions in the Q&A, and boy, we are getting a slew of questions already. So thank you so much. And I just want to follow up, actually, Celine, on what you just said. We have a relevant question in the Q&A from Addie Gorstein, which is about the PA's role vis-a-vis the settler violence. The question is, why is the Palestinian Authority security forces not helping to fight the pogroms? Can you talk a little bit about what the Palestinian security forces might or might not be able to do? How could that work? And Lior, if you want to jump in as well, but Celine, to you first.
So first, this pogrom, this violence do not take place in Area A. They take place in Area B or in Area C, and these areas are not under the security responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. They do not have authority to act there. It's more than that. If the PA forces were to cross Area B, Area A in uniform, they would be considered as threatening the Israeli forces. So there is not such a situation. And I want to strengthen one point that Lior said, and that in my view is very much important. The IDF has the overall responsibility to maintain law and order in the Palestinian territory. The Israeli police is accountable to the IDF. This is not just a statement. It is a situation that results from both the Israeli and international law. And therefore, this is why the fact that the IDF has not been acting on this issue is so problematic. And so this is part of the response, but we can elaborate further if you want.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to zoom out a little bit on that. I want to come back to the question of accountability that you raised, Lior, which is obviously extremely important in a number of ways. And obviously, if accountability doesn't happen, as you really stressed, why would these attacks not continue, especially if the settlers feel like they're accomplishing their goals? There was a piece in Times of Israel the other day that was basically a can't they or won't they? Is it that the Israeli authorities can't control the violence, or they just won't? And in fact, we have an anonymous attendee who asks exactly that question: can't or won't control it. Lior, what's your analysis on that point?
I have two answers to that, brief ones. I'll be brief now. The first is that it doesn't matter, because if they don't, they have the responsibility to do so. And if they can't or won't, then the Israeli military is saying something very dangerous. They're saying we cannot maintain our duty, and then maybe the international community should ask itself, maybe we should enter forces to protect them, because Israel is not blind by its by its responsibility to do so. It's to make a statement that they can't or won't is a very dangerous step for the Israeli military to take, or for the Israeli government to stand behind, because it's like saying, it's anarchy and nobody's protecting the Palestinians, and therefore Israel it's violating international law, etc. That's the first answer. And now, say more than that. This is the analysis. The analysis should be that the Israeli military won't or can't, because for so long it hasn't. And if it hasn't, then it either can't or won't, or it doesn't have the willingness to do so. So this is the point where I think that the political sort of analysis should state that the Israeli military is either can't or won't. And now for the genuine answer is that I think it doesn't have the willpower to do so, because I just can't imagine that if this was the flip side, if we had 200 Palestinians getting close to an Israeli settlement, this wouldn't be stopped immediately and violently, with many arrests, if not deaths, etc. And we don't want to even imagine that. And it's not, you don't even have to go to this extent. Every Palestinian who harms, who violates or risks Israeli life is under immediate threat, to be a life threat, to be arrested, whatever. That's like something that the Israeli government prides, that whoever tries to risk or harm Israelis will be caught. So I just can't, in my imagination, believe that the Israeli military can't do it. My analysis also takes us to a very clear one, that there's completely lack of willpower, because there's no political willpower to do so. If the military will do so, they won't get the backing from the government. This government certainly, but also previous governments. Let me share something really, I think, I said I'll be brief, but I'll say a really short anecdote from today. And this is part of the reward system. The settlers, during the pogroms, they also established 7 new outposts in the occupied territory. So they use the time when there's violence by them to also take over Palestinian land and establish outposts. The military enabled it, but after a few days, today, it wanted to evacuate one of the outposts, at least one of them. The Minister of Defense gave the order, because in order to evacuate an outpost, you have to get the approval and the consent of the agreement and the signature of the Minister of Defense. So he ordered the evacuation of that outpost. The settlers immediately petitioned to the Israeli Supreme Court to be asking them, stop the evacuation. It's an illegal evacuation for whatever reason, of nonsense, of course. But then what followed was amazing. The Israeli legal system, the judiciary, it defended its action to evacuate the outpost to the courts. They started saying, we are evacuating this because for so many different reasons. And then Minister Smotrich, a minister within the Ministry of Defense and also a finance minister, wrote a very severe and strict letter to the Attorney General of the government saying, you cannot defend the state on this. This is wrong. This is not our position. Our position is basically, in other words, but he said it very, very bluntly and clearly, we are supporting the settlers. That's what he said. We do not want to evacuate them. And it's just, you can't grasp it, because one hand of the Israeli government is trying to evacuate, while the other one is not enabling to do so. It's just, you can't grasp it. I don't think there's anywhere in the world that you have such, I don't know, I can barely explain how it is. But anyway, I'll stop here.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that. It really is, it's really incredible. Talking about the role of the military a little bit further, one thing that I'd like to dive into a little bit is, we know that the role of the IDF in the occupied territories, a key mission is to protect the settlers. And so we see in these attacks that soldiers seem to be involved in some way. In some cases, it appears that they may be aiding and abetting and facilitating. And I wonder if, Celine, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the role of soldiers at times in these attacks.
Yes. Well, even though legally the IDF bears responsibility, it has indeed been consistently reluctant to act against settlers in these circumstances, and have solely relied on the police, throwing the responsibility on the Israeli police to do so. Although IDF soldiers are always the first one to reach the scene. The police do not have the resource, are less present on the ground. So there is rarely a situation in which police would be the first to come and intervene in the situation. But also, to put it simply, the IDF as an organization, and as you indicated, see as its mission the defense of Israeli citizens, and have difficulty to put themselves in a position where they will protect Palestinians against Israeli citizens attacking them, although this is clearly one of their obligations. But as a consequence of that, Israeli soldiers are basically not trained to perform law enforcement tasks. They do not know how to collect testimony. They do not know how to behave in these circumstances. And therefore, we see very problematic situation as the one that have been often filmed on the ground. But may I come back for 1 second to your question about accountability? In my view, the first and main thing that is required is not necessarily to look at what the IDF has or has not done. It is problematic, but in my view, that's not like the first problem. The main problem is that there is no political willingness on the part of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense to regard this issue as important and significant, and their readiness and determination to confront power bases that enjoy significant political representation is inexistent. And this is key to the ability of the law enforcement authority to address this crime. And therefore, they must be the primary target of demands for accountability. They must instruct the security and law enforcement agency that answer to them to act decisively. They need to allocate a resource for that. They need to monitor outcome. They need to support them when they do so. And what we have seen is the contrary. There have been, not a lot, but there have been quite senior IDF officials and also in Shin Bet that have tried to act more aggressively against that. The result for them in their career is that they have not been promoted. It is very important to understand that dynamic. because they are not backed, they will be rebuffed, and they will be bypassed in their rank by others. And this dynamic is at the core of the problem. And when you talked earlier about the language used, pogrom and terror, these words have been used by the IDF and Shin Bet head of agency in the context of what happened in Tormuz Aya. If you're looking at what the Prime Minister and the MOD has been saying, it is strikingly different. And this, in my view, is very much reflects the lack of backing. The Prime Minister basically compared what happened in Tormuz to the protester closing the highway road. This is just unbelievable. And this is the word he has used. He has not used the word terror. He has not used the word pogrom. He has said that law needs to be respected in the territories, but also in the highway, in the Island Highway in Tel Aviv, where protesters come every week in the context of the judicial overlaw. This, in my view, is just not use of word. This is incitement. And it has to be called out as incitement of violence. So this is one point that for me it was very important to stress in that conversation.
Celine, I just want to comment on that. First of all, we had a question in the Q&A that's related to what you just talked about. It's from Seth Pollack, who wanted to know what language and justification we're hearing from government ministers who are not condemning these actions. And I believe you were referring to Simcha Rothman just then, in terms of the MK who made the comparison between the settlers rampaging in the West Bank on the one hand and the protesters on the other, if I'm not mistaken.
This is Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Oh, Prime Minister Netanyahu had made that analogy. All right, well, there you go. Even more so. So that hopefully, Seth, that helps to answer your question. I know we did also hear it from Simcha Rothman, which is significant in the sense that he is advancing the judicial overhaul, but obviously very significant to hear it from the Prime Minister as well. So thank you for pointing that out, Celine. And before we move on, Lior, did you want to comment at all on instances in which it seems like we see members of the IDF engaging in some way in the settler violence?
I think that what, Yesh Din does a lot of this and monitors a lot of this, and what Yesh Din shows and is that, there's so many instances that you see settlers throwing stones at Palestinian homes in Palestinian towns. So you can't argue that it's a dispute because it's happening in a Palestinian town. So some settlers had to come down to the Palestinian town to do this. And then you see the military coming, and most often it would throw tear gas at the Palestinians and would never, I wouldn't say never, but rarely, I can't recall a case that they prevent or they arrest the Israeli settlers. They most often claim that it's not their responsibility, that it's the Israeli police, but this is frankly not true. And the commanders know that it's not true. And then there's a question of whether the soldiers are not being educated rightly or not. Or it's like they're not, just for other reasons, they're not protecting or arresting or doing something to stop it from the settler end. And I think it's, after so many years of this being documented and dealt with and legal correspondence around it and public discussion around it, I don't think you can accept like such an excuse. I think that it's, it's so much documented and discussed, and then you just can't accept it. But frankly, on the ground, yes, there's so many cases that you see soldiers coming in. Their immediate, role is to prevent violence, to de-escalate the situation. But of course, they see their position, their role is first and foremost to defend the Israeli citizens, to defend the Israeli settlers. They look at the Palestinians as the enemy. And then on the ground, that's what happens. So even if the Israeli settlers are the violent perpetrators, the Palestinians will most likely be those who suffer, be arrested, have tear gas, and the Israelis will be protected and nothing will happen to them.
So in terms of pursuing accountability, there's a question from Martin Raffel, who is getting at the issue of the ubiquitousness, I think, of information and ability to get at the identity of perpetrators. He asks whether Palestinians have used smartphones to capture the violence and the identity of the perpetrators that can then be shared with Israeli and international authorities. I mean, I would just add to that, we know the extent to which Israel employs, cameras throughout the West Bank. So just, what can you say about, and Lior, I think this is probably more a question for you, but whether technology is playing a role in aiding authorities, if they were so inclined, to know who was perpetrating these crimes.
Look, when we had cases at Yesh Din that we had such, all the evidence there, which we're not supposed to provide, the police and the military are supposed to do it, and still the military closed the cases. You have places that you saw, the soldiers were present and the military didn't even question the soldiers who were there about the situation. So it does come to absurd measures, like that they literally don't want to do it. If you ask, I remember asking a Palestinian when I just started Yesh Din, like, maybe this is our project, we'll bid you a bunch of cameras and that will be the idea. And then he rightly said, and I've learned, over the years that it's true that somehow, technology hasn't managed to grasp this, but when there's a camera in the occupied territories, it sometimes always catches the Palestinians and never catches the Israeli settlers. And that's the feeling that the Palestinians have. And we've seen it. When I was director of Yesh Din, and to this day, you see Palestinian field researchers of Yesh Din, they capture the violence on camera. It's just you can't explain it otherwise.
I want to talk a little bit about, digging a little bit further into the policy of this far right, very pro-settler government. One of the things that we are seeing, of course, and Peace Now documents this so beautifully and importantly through its Settlement Watch project, the explosion in settlement units being advanced. And so maybe Lior, if you could tell us a little bit about what we're seeing, and Celine, if you could weigh in on the impact of these settlements and the sort of nexus between that and settler violence. So Lior, I'm gonna turn to you first, and then you, Celine.
Okay, so I'll start to be brief, but I think that what we're seeing, first of all, is record numbers, and that's like the major thing is that you're seeing that now in the first half of the year, this Israeli government advanced the amount of settler housing units that has never been the highest figure in any other year since Peace Now and Settlement Watch has started documenting this. And this is in a half a year now, we've overachieved any other year in amount of settler settlement houses. The second thing that I will stress is that there's also a complete the outposts. Outposts are settlements by all means, according to international law. In practice, they are communities, but they're illegal according to Israeli law. And that what Israel is doing there is also, to an extent, it's we haven't seen anything unlike not anything like this in the past to the extent. And that's the retroactive legalization of these outposts. And what it means is politically is that Israel is officially creating new settlements. So under international law, Israel should be accused of building new settlements. This is the reason why they haven't done so far. So maybe for the Israelis in the past, they established the outposts in order to refrain from creating new settlements, and now they're sort of recognizing them. But more importantly is that once you retroactively legalize an outpost, then it changes from maybe 10, 15, 30 mobile homes to a large settlement of 200, 300 housing units with infrastructure, roads, etc., and a lot of finance coming in, of course, and it changes the landscape completely. So these are, and this is happening again in a very extent. Israel has already, this government has already retroactively legalized, I think now 18 housing illegal outposts. And they also made a decision to contribute, to start providing electricity and infrastructure to almost all of the outposts already, even though they're not legal. So they're creating a new legal stand here. So you have settlements, which are considered legal in practice by Israel. You have the outposts, which are illegal. And in regards to these outposts, they're either on a way of being legalized, and if they're not legalized quite yet, then they're already receiving infrastructure and roads and electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just changing the reality on the ground. And I want to remind you that, of course, that all settlements are illegal. All settlements eventually or directly harm Palestinian human rights because they cause settler violence. They bring the occupation much closer to the Palestinians living there, and they take their lands and prevent the development of Palestinian towns. And from politically speaking, it's the main purpose is to prevent a Palestinian state. And that's what's happening. It's to cut the West Bank and to fragment it. And it's happening in a very rapid pace. That's why I'll frame it in a way. That's why it's much more important for the government to establish, or for the right wing or for the settlers to establish new settlements or new outposts rather than to build in the current settlement.
Thank you so much for that, Lior. Celine, what's your sense of the impact of this tremendous explosion in the settlement footprint and the establishment of outposts?
First, I want to strengthen one of Lior's point, that we cannot differentiate between this violence and the fact that it is linked to the struggle over the control of land in the West Bank and to the systematic leniency against illegal land grabs and eventually, as Lior explained, retroactive approval. What is this reactive approval? It is what creates ultimately the deep sense of impunity that is also fueling that violence. Now, in my view, what we need to look at when we watch the policy of that government, but maybe before that, the phenomenon that we are seeing with this terror attack by Jewish nationalists, it's not something that was born by this government. So everything that we refer to is not only linked to the very problematic policy and aggressive one that the current government is pushing. Maybe it has been done more gently or more under the table with previous government, but no government in Israel has really addressed that problem. Now, I think that maybe we should look not only in terms of the number of settlement approval and outposts that are retroactively legalized, but also to the fact that this government is basically creating the legal basis, what we have called the judicial overhaul, but also that is already being implemented in the repartition of responsibility between the Ministry of Defense and the fact that another position has been created within the Ministry of Defense in the hand of Bezalel Smotrich, who is a civilian, and that has now, under his authority, the ability to speed up all these processes of requalifying the status of land, paving the ground so that outposts that have been built on private lands will be legalized. The fact that, which is even more dramatic in my view, that legal advisor working in the ministry will not be anymore independent, but will be political appointees and will not be able to challenge the fact that these measures and these legal decisions are in contradiction with higher value in the Israeli legal system. This is much more dramatic than just and I don't want to belittle the approval of settlements in no way, but this just created in another scale where it will be impossible for the Israeli Supreme Court to stop it. And it's a problem in another dimension.
Thank you so much for that, Celine. So we have questions from at least 3 of our viewers in the Q&A that are intricately related and on a very important topic that I want to turn to now. The questions are from Robert Snyder, Greg Manoff, and Sophie Schnaper, who identifies herself as one of the organizers of the pro-Israeli democracy protests in Boston. And the questions are all about the connection between the attack on Israeli democracy and the deepening on steroids of the occupation. I'm going to read Sophie's question. Do you have a recommendation for the Israeli protest movement leaders on how they should pivot their stands in regards to the occupation issue? We know that Kaplan leaders, the Kaplan protests, try not to center the resistance on occupation. What would you tell them is the right thing to be done? Who wants to jump in on this one?
I don't mind. Celine, if you want to go ahead.
No, start, please. It's a tricky one.
No, look, I'll say from our point of view, and I'll just say that Peace Now has, our positioning is that we have to, our mandate right now is to do exactly that. And that is to raise awareness within the demonstrators, the protesters we're part of. We're all, whoever has a sense in mind in regards to Israel and cares about this place, realizes that the judicial changes are changing Israel's landscape and political sort of regime completely. And it will be very hard to come back. But I think one has to ask himself, even if we win completely, and Netanyahu and his government it does not do any other step in regards to the judicial changes, and they'll back down for whatever reason, and they'll say, okay, you're right. In the fantasy, you're right. What kind of Israel will we have? What kind of a democracy can occupy another people? What kind of and live in their lands? And that's the problem. I think that that's the challenge that we have. That the progressives, the Jewish progressives, I think should contribute to. That the progressives in Israel. That's what Peace Now is we're trying to do, is to educate and convince and to basically mobilize the democratic camp, the liberal camp inside Israel, to realize that occupation, you can't have democracy with occupation. And you can't control other people and take over their lands. And it's a very big challenge, but there's no other, that's the thing that we have to do, because otherwise Israel will just not be a democracy.
Celine.
Okay. Why it's a tricky question? Because even though I agree with Lior that it's kind of impossible to separate the issue of the democracy with the issue of occupation. What happened in the street in Israel has managed to bring so many people over such a long period because it has managed to remain simplistic in, what it is about, that it is about Israeli democracy. Now, you will see that at any attempt of the protest to bring another issue, whether it's occupation or anything that basically has, they have tried to kind of bring into the discussion, has lowered the number of persons coming to the street. And therefore, even though it is maybe painful, for me, in order to sustain that protest, I think tactically, I understand the logic of keeping it simple. But there is another discussion that has to take place, is how the opposition, we engage with them so that indeed they understand that once they will get the mandate and that they will have to encourage democratic values in the Israeli legal system, so that indeed we don't come back to the situation in which we are now, that they indeed fully understand that you cannot ignore occupation when you do that, and that they will have to address these issues. For me, that's more the kind of challenge that as a policy planning think tank, I'm looking at, that these leaders in the opposition, if one day they return to power, and I want to be optimistic, that indeed they will not fall into the trap of separating the two and ignoring one at the expense of the other.
But can I play devil's advocate with you for a moment, Celine, if I may?
Yes.
If the protesters themselves are not making this connection, why should the opposition, why would you expect the opposition leaders to make the connection and behave any differently than they have in the past, if there's not public pressure on them from the mainstream pro-democracy movement, if that makes sense?
No, it does. It does make sense, but maybe I tend to be a top-down believer. I think that leaders that understand the complexity of Israeli reality has to lead the public, and it's more true in my view than the other way around. And unfortunately, the Israeli public has been convinced that we can continue the occupation forever, ever. I do think that the key leader in the opposition understand that this is not sustainable. I think that they did voice message in that direction when they were in power last year. Unfortunately, I think that they has not translated that into a different policy, and they should be challenged on that. And this is more the kind of engagement we are doing. But I understand the complexity, but I'm just afraid that if indeed we try to force it into the street now, we will end up with only 10 people coming. And that this is my concern. I want to be realistic. I hope it would be different, but I'm afraid it's not.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Celine. I appreciate that. And thank you for allowing me to play devil's advocate there for just a minute. The last, and first of all, I want to apologize to we have had such great engagement in terms of questions from the audience today, which I love. It's phenomenal. And I want to apologize because we're not going to get to all the questions within our hour, which is unfortunate, but my appreciation to everyone who did contribute their questions. There is one topic that is very important for us to cover as we wrap things up and come to the end of the hour, which is the question of what the United States can do. We obviously, this is a J Street webinar with lots of American, Jewish American, other American viewers, including staffers on the Hill who are watching and want to know what the U.S. government can do. I think it's, Celine, you've mentioned a few times that last week you mentioned the village of Tormusaya, where there was a major rampage. The one Palestinian who was killed in Tormusaya was in fact a U.S. permanent resident. And this is a village where the majority of residents are U.S. citizens. So this has come to directly impact U.S. citizens as well. And so the question is, what can the United States do? What would you like to see the United States do? And I'd love to hear from both of you on that. So Celine, do you want to jump in first and then Lior?
Yes. What I said before about the choice of words that are used by Israeli leaders to describe this act of violence, in my view, also apply to the US administration. And anything that obscure or belittle this act contribute to the perpetuation of this phenomenon. And in the discussion we just had about why occupation and why the Israeli public is not worried about the occupation. The Israeli public and this government and our prime minister are in a deep state of denial regarding how these developments affect the Israeli position and its relation with the key leaders in the international community. And therefore, I think it is very important that the US administration will condemn more strongly, for example, the parallel made by the prime minister between the protester on the highway and the pogrom inflicted to this village. And I think that to point out that the fact that doing this parallel not only belittle the action, but legitimize it. And that therefore this word should be qualified as incitement. And the word incitement to violence has consistently been used solely regarding the Palestinian. Only the Palestinian leadership has been attacked and challenged on the issue of incitement of violence. I think that in the context of this event, the same word and the word terror should be used to qualify it. I think it would be very powerful, and it will make clear that Israel is accountable to the same extent than the Palestinian leadership when it comes to terror and when it comes to violence. A next step that could be done is that those that perpetrate this act should be indeed, the same way that we list Palestinian tourists that cannot get visa to get to the US. I don't see any reason why it should not be the same in this case. So I think there is some kind of symmetry here that will be healthy and that will convey a powerful message, not only, by the way, to the Israeli leaders, but also to the Israeli public.
Thank you, Celine. Lior, your thoughts. What leverage does the United States have? What would you like to see the US do?
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. The first is that I really feel that from a policy perspective is that this is a golden opportunity, and I'll try to explain why. Because for many years, it's been really hard to push the international community and the Americans on the issue of Israel, and the excuse was that we don't want we want to engage Israel in the peace process, and we understand the political sensitivities. There's a right republic in Israel. We can't fully pressure them, etc., in order to get them engaged. That I feel, from my really humble perspective, I'm not doing policy in the United States. I'm not familiar. I'm not an expert like you guys are, like you certainly are, Debra and Celine, on U.S. policy. But the government of Israel is not only doing an action, destroying a two-state solution, as they've done for many years, now on steroids, right? That's what we discussed earlier. They're saying it in their own words. There will never be a Palestinian state. We're actively working in order to prevent that. And they have no intention to do so. Now, I think that the first and foremost that the US administration and the entire international community has to ask itself, Israel is now in a new status. It's a country that will never enable a Palestinian state. It will always be an occupier. Palestinians will never have self-determination or sovereignty. Now, if this is the case, then how do we treat Israel as a friend of ours, right? That we want it to succeed and prosper. But how do you treat the state of Israel like that? And that's, I think, first of all, the reality check that I would ask anyone who's doing policy in the United States. This is the status. Get out of, shake them up a bit. This is where we are at. Now, the second thing that I want to say is that I feel that we still have to really legitimize and strengthen voices that are doing such actions on the ground, the human rights community in Israel, the left-wing community in Israel, the pro-peace community in Israel that's working, who still don't have the complete legitimacy within the Jewish community, even the progressive one. We just saw, right, how the minister Shikli, Minister Shikli attacked J Street a couple of weeks ago. I really hope that the entire Jewish community, including AIPAC, completely disregarded them. Particularly, I don't know, Debra, but I hope that you'll provide a good answer to this. But to support J Street and support groups in Israel as well that do such work. And maybe I'll just say an example. It seems like a water, a tip of, how do you call it, like a dip in the sea. But next week on Friday, Peace Now, with a coalition of many other human rights and left-wing organizations and peace organizations in Israel, we're doing a joint Israeli-Palestinian demonstration in Burqa, a Palestinian village that suffered from a lot of Palestinian from settler violence, to a land of Burqa that settlers have established one of the most violent outposts there. And we're going to march, a peaceful march. We got an invitation from the people of Burqa. We're doing this jointly together. And I really hope that these sort of, there are places of, of value that we can do. And these, I think, need to be amplified and legitimized in the more central Jewish community in Israel, and of course in the administration.
Thank you for that. There are, of course, Israeli and Palestinian organizations on the ground that are doing incredible work. Obviously, Peace Now is very much one of them. And we should note that one of the policies of this government is to attack peace and humanitarian organizations to try to prevent them from getting funding from outside. This is something I think on which the Biden administration has really weighed in. We've actually seen legislation. I'm talking about the bill from MK Kulner to tax at a 65% rate donations from foreign state entities to that come to humanitarian organizations. We have seen that kind of tabled after some pretty intensive action by the international community, including the Biden administration. And that, of course, is a positive step. But there is so much more to be done. There's so much more to be said as a part of this conversation. But we have just exceeded by a little bit the end of the hour. So I'm going to wrap us up here. As I do that, I want to offer my profound thanks to Celine Touboul, Lior Amihai, not just for joining us during this hour, but for the incredibly important work that you are both doing. And we're so grateful to both of you and to your organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debra. Thank you, J Street.
Thank you very much, Debra and J Street. Thank you for hosting us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. All right. Have a great rest of your day, folks. And thank you so much for spending the time with us. Take care.